The degree of devastation in Puerto Rico after Hurricane Maria is almost unimaginable, but for the first 6 or 7 days, the television coverage was quite modest compared to that for various political controversies, and sometimes it was framed like this.
Tonight, the president responds when asked, has he done enough for Puerto Rico? The governor there saying they face a humanitarian disaster.
Growing fears of a mass exodus from Puerto Rico as President Trump defends his administration's response.
A cry for help from Puerto Rico.
Help needs to get into people's hands now, not tomorrow, not later, now.
The president says he's on it.
Joining us now from Miami is Antonio Mora, former news anchor at Good Morning America and a Latin American affairs analyst. And why was there such meager or modest coverage in the first few days? And what do you make now that there is more coverage of the way, for example, those evening news stories were framed?
Well, the reality is, Howie, I don't understand why there wasn't more coverage to begin with. You could give all sorts of excuses that there was hurricane fatigue because we were coming off of Harvey and Irma. The Mexico earthquake was the day before the Puerto Rican earthquake. But how at the networks no voices were raised and said, we've got to cover this other hurricane in the same way that we covered Harvey and Irma. This is also U.S. territory. Puerto Rico isn't that far away from New York City. It's about the same distance as Houston is. So how there were no voices raised and said we have to send our big guns, just like we sent the big guns to Houston and the big guns to Florida to cover this story. I don't understand that. And honestly, the only way I can explain it from a network standpoint is that simply there's not enough Latino voices at the networks who might have cried out and said, guys, you cannot make this coverage so different.
Let me stop you there because that's an interesting point. I do think some of the major newspaper coverage was better from the start. So yeah. I was going to ask you, is this related to the fact that Puerto Rico most of the time is just kind of a blip on the American media radar? But now when you say not enough Latino voices, you're sort of suggesting that Puerto Rico is covered differently because it is an island, not part of the mainland, U.S. territory, American citizens, of course, that is Hispanic and generally impoverished.
Howie, you saw the poll that showed that half of Americans didn't realize that Puerto Ricans were American citizens. Mm-hmm. So there clearly is a difference in the way Puerto Rico is looked at. There is the aspect that it is a little farther away than Houston or Florida, and so maybe that affects it. But I do believe that there is a lack of Latino representation at the networks, in the executive suites, and the executive producer ranks, on the anchor ranks, from Monday through Friday. 6 a.m. to midnight. There is not one Latino, zero at CNN, Fox, MSNBC, ABC News, NBC News, or CBS News. I would think that if there had been any significant voices in those newsrooms, somebody would have said, hey guys, we've got to cover this the same way. We've got to send Anderson Cooper down there before the storm, not more than a week after. We've got to send Nora O'Donnell down there.
At least he went, and many big name anchors did not. But why should it take, I take your point about underrepresentation, but why should it take Latino voices to tell the people who make decisions on television networks that Puerto Rico, Americans, 3.5 million folks, and massive food shortages, water, gas, and all of that. Why should it take Latino voices?
And Howie, it shouldn't. And if you go back and you look at some of the newspaper. Well, I believe it does. And if you go back and look at the newspaper coverage before Puerto Rico, before Maria hit Puerto Rico, it was clear that everybody knew how bad this was going to be. Irma had already knocked out power to 1 million people in Puerto Rico. So a direct hit from a Category 4 storm. You should see what Miami looks like 2 weeks after Irma hit as a Category 1. So you can imagine an impoverished island like Puerto Rico, what it would go through if a Category 4 made a direct hit. So there were already articles talking about how this could mean power out for most of the island for 3 to 6 months. Right. So this should have been a big story that should have been covered very intensely. And I do put some blame on the White House because I do believe that while they probably underestimated the response. They sent in thousands of people. They did preposition some aid, but clearly not enough.
We are going to get into that in the next segment. Antonio Mora, thanks very much for joining us from Miami.
Thank you, Art.